right, let's pray, and then we'll get started. We'll have some fun. God, thank you so much, Lord, for just an opportunity to be here with these folks who have kids and who love you and love their kids. And so, Lord, I thank you for that commonality that we all have in this room, Lord. And not only that, but we all want what's best for our kids, and we desperately want to be the kind of parent that would honor you. And so I pray that this session would be a continuation of all the good things that have already happened this weekend, and that it's your voice that would be heard, and that you would teach each one of us something new about the kids in our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. Well, I think I'm the B team, because I think Katie Fruget was the A team and she couldn't be here. So I'm here. My name is Shelly. I'm from Dallas Baptist University, where I teach in children and family ministry. But before that, I was a children's minister for about 25 years. And I have 3 kids that are 25, 23, and 21. So although they're a little easier to manage now because they're all pretty well launched, I remember the days of having them at home and the stress of wanting to be a good parent. And so I know that's why you all are at this retreat. So I want to talk to you guys about Gen Alpha. How many of you guys have heard of Gen Alpha? A few, a little bit, okay? How many of you have never even heard that term? Okay, so a few, it's okay. So Gen Alpha are the kids, and I'll get really into detail later, that have born since 2010. Okay, so how many of you guys have Gen Alpha kids? Okay, so most of you do. All right, so you've heard all of the stereotypical things about Gen Xers, which I am, millennials, and Gen Z. And so I'm going to kind of share with you some of the stereotypical things about them, and then also talk about how do we impact their worldview. And so I have this picture up here. How many of you guys, when you are on an airplane and you're in a window seat, you do like to look out to see? Yeah, I love the window seat. This is me going to see my son who lives in Colorado a few months ago. And I always look out the window. I always kind of want to see, like, where am I? Try to figure out where am I in relation to where I'm going? What does it look like from up here? And that's how I'd kind of characterize what we're going to do today. We're going to kind of peek out the window at the world and look at the horizon and see what we see that's going to impact Gen Alpha. So we're painting a broad brush, and we're going to think about some things that maybe we don't see because we're in the weeds all the time, right? So that's kind of what we're going to do. And I think about the scripture, and I'm probably taking it out of context a little bit, but where the men of Issachar were described as people who understood the times and knew what to do. And so as parents, that's what we want to do. We want to kind of understand the times, understand this viewpoint, to try to figure out how do we then parent maybe in a different way if we need to. And so, why is that not working? A reminder, though, that every generation thinks they're more intelligent than the one before it, right? So we all have that sort of arrogance about ourselves. But in reality, I want to talk just specifically about what's going on in Gen Alpha's world. So I gave you actually a copy of all the slides. A lot of times I put blanks in there, but I ran out of time yesterday. Yesterday was graduation, and also we lost a couple student workers, so I didn't get to do the blanks for you. So you have all of the slides if you want to make notes. But one of the books that I use in helping understand Gen Alpha is a book called Generations by Jean Twang. If you know Jean Twang, she wrote iGen. She's the one that did all the research about how phones have impacted Gen Z. Okay, she's the one who's really famous for that. And sort of 2 of her theses all revolve around technology. Right, technology is pervasive in all of our lives and in our kids' lives, and she talks about it in the sense that we now have a very hyper-individualized world that our kids are growing up, and they're growing up in a slow life as compared to generations before that were in a collectivism mindset where we do what's best for the common good, that we think of other people, right? It's a collectivism, a communal type society. And so she contrasts how technology has fed that individualism, right? Technology allows us to individualize everything, even to the point when we're on an airplane, we all can watch our own thing, right? Remember when you used to go on an airplane and you would all watch the same movie all at once? But individualism is definitely one of those things that I think is impacting our kids. And then the slow life, fast life. So what she means by that is previous generations had more of a fast life, meaning they grew up faster because they were given responsibilities at a faster pace. That's how she uses that term. Whereas our kids today are growing up more slowly because they're not being given those same responsibilities. They're being given a lot of privileges, but not a lot of responsibility. So if you're interested in generational studies, she actually unpacks all the generations and sort of just introduces alpha. But technology, if you can just put that in the back of your brain, that is a big piece of the horizon that our kids are in, and we'll talk more about that here in a minute. So a couple of things to be aware of when we think about Gen Alpha, is what's going on in their world. To be aware of, mental health issues are huge, and they're not just for Gen Alpha, they're for Gen Z, and they're for parents, right? And so one of the ways that we help our kids with their mental health is to manage our mental health, which a lot of us aren't doing a good job of that. But in 2021, it was a national emergency that was declared right after COVID, that mental health for our kids was at such a high rate. And when we think about those mental health statistics, or those things, that how it plays out is through anxiety, depression, suicide, and loneliness. So our kids are growing up in sort of this world where all of this is very, very normal and almost expected. And if you look at depression among boys, it's up 161% since 2010. And the suicide rates are higher among boys. And what Jean Twang and some others believe is that as boys have withdrawn from the real world into the virtual world of gaming, that mental health, those mental health statistics and the suicide rates have gone up. The highest rate that's gone up is 11 to 14-year-old boys, okay? So mental health is definitely an issue for our kids. And one of the sort of cultural pictures of this, if you saw Dear Evan Hansen, anybody see that? Okay, this is a picture of the mental health of our kiddos, and this is more teenagers. I don't recommend this as a family movie. There's some themes and some things that go on in it that you don't want probably to introduce your kids to. But one of the songs is You Will Be Found, which is all about loneliness and all about wanting to be seen. And so those are the types of themes that our kids are growing up in. Anxiety is one of the biggest issues that our kids are dealing with. And I work at DBU, and guess what? The Christian kids have it too. My kids, I have a couple of them that struggle with it, right? And they've been in church and they know coping mechanisms. I'm a counselor, right? But they're living in a world that sort of increases that for them. And here's some of the reasons that I think, these are sort of my opinion, along with some research, is that they live in a world where there's just constant comparison. And surely as parents, you guys feel that too, right? You feel that on social media when you see everybody else's kid, making the A honor roll or whatever it might be. We're constantly comparing ourselves. And so imagine growing up being able to compare your life constantly with the people that you are around. They also very much have a peer reference, meaning they're just all sort of sitting around looking at each other through social media, through Snapchat, Instagram, whatever it might be. And there's not as much of a generational reference with adults in their lives. And peer-to-peer reference is not the best thing for kids, right? We want them to have important adults in their lives. I think also some of them have imposter syndrome. Maybe we do too, because we know what we put on Facebook or whatever social media platform we use is what? It's the highlight reels of everything. It's the best of us. And I think our kids know that that's not really themselves. And so it's sort of that imposter syndrome, because they know that even though they're portraying this, that's not really how they feel about themselves. So imposter syndrome. Agency and grit deficiencies. So agency is a beautiful word that we want our kids to have. And that's that ability when a problem comes up that they don't shut down, that they don't get fearful, but that something in their brain clicks and says, I can figure this out. I've done this before. I know how to solve this problem. And so kids with a high sense of agency can overcome things. And the way that kids get a high sense of agency is as children to be able to solve problems. And outdoor play, independent play, peer play is one of the best places for them to begin to learn to solve some problems, to begin to practice for adulthood. And so also, we have a lot of kids who have sort of this fixed mindset where if they're not good at it when they first try it, what are they going to do? They're not going to do it again. And so grit is one of those things, passion plus perseverance, right? And so our kids have to learn the power of the word yet. I'm not able to do it yet, but with some practice, I can do it. But we live in a world that's a very fixed mindset. Information is a burden. They have too much information. I don't know about you. I'm 54. I'll just be honest how old I am. I don't like to ever Google my symptoms or my mom's symptoms. My dad passed away this year, but I don't like to Google symptoms. Why? It stresses me out. I always have cancer, right? I've always got something that's going on. And so our kids are sort of overwhelmed by all that information. Some of them have performance burnout. We've pushed them. We've made performance a whole lot more important than character development and process. And so they're burned out on that. And I'm talking not just about Gen Alpha, but this is Gen Z too, right? They have relational poverty. If you look at every statistic, and if you talk to very many kids, and even if you talk to adults, some of you feel this way too, we don't have the strong relationships that we had in the past. And most kids feel some sense of loneliness. It is one of the biggest things, even on the college campus, that can sort of predict retention, is if the kids don't find those friends and they feel lonely, what are they going to do? They're going to give up and go home. And what we see is, whereas before a student would wait till maybe May to do that, now 3 or 4 weeks in, they're packing up and going home because of this extreme loneliness. And so we also see some spiritual formation delays because kids are not in church like they used to be. They're not getting all of the programming and the ministry, and it's not happening a lot of times at home. So all of those things can sort of feed into that anxiety. And so being aware of those mental health problems, sort of understanding a little bit about anxiety, but some of the macro trends, those big picture things, those big mountains that are on the horizon are, these are related a lot to anxiety, but one of them is they have an external locus of control. Does anybody know what an external locus of control is? I feel like I'm going to slow down a little.
Worrying about everybody else instead of themselves.
Okay, worrying about, that's part of it for sure. What else might it be?
Outside events control you.
Yeah.
Under control.
Right. So an external locus of control can be worried about everything outside of you, but also it's this sense that I don't really have an ability to impact what happens to me. And so what we want kids to have is an internal locus of control that says, when they bump up against something, I can figure this out. I've done this before. I know that there's a way to solve this problem. And that sounds like a very basic thing, but our kids are struggling with that, particularly at the college level. And of course, as Christians, not only want them to have an internal locus, but we want them to have an eternal, right? We want them to look to the Heavenly Father as well, to be the person that they look to. But our kids today, many of them feel very helpless. It's almost like a learned helplessness that they've gotten. So a lot of them don't have as much independent play because we're so worried about their performance. And one of the greatest gifts we can give young children is a play-based childhood, not a performance-based childhood. And so I know it's hard because we want our kids, we're afraid that they're not going to catch up or that they're going to be behind. But the kind of skills that our world needs come from play. Negotiation, compromise, working together, being creative, all of those things that we need in our world are missing because kids were not allowed to do all those kinds of things. And we'll talk a little bit about that. later. Cyber socialization, they're learning how to date and relate to each other through phone, right? Through the internet, through YouTube, through whatever it might be, instead of the normal socialization. That hyper-individualism is pervasive throughout our kids' lives. And then they're growing up in a world that's polarized and tribal. Y'all probably haven't noticed that, have you? Yeah, I mean, it is one of the saddest things to me is to see that polarized tribal us versus them, you're either for me, against me type of mindset. Our kids are not seeing us as adults be able to disagree in a kind and gracious way, or to be able to question things in a kind and gracious way. And so they're growing up in that, which is very different from what maybe some of you all did. There's an absence of shared truth. Anybody watch Social Dilemma? It was out a few years ago. That's one of their biggest claims, and that's a secular group saying that one of the things that's going to tear our world apart is an absence of shared truth, meaning there's just very few things that any of us can sit in a room and agree on. If you look at all the news lately, if you look at social media, it is constant absence of shared truth. And we double down on our version of it, right? So absence of shared truth, and one of the reporters asked the guy that did this particular thing, and he was at Google and all these places. They said, "What is your biggest concern?" And this guy said, about 5 years ago, I believe it was, civil war. That was his concern, is that when you have a society that cannot agree on anything, you're eventually going to fight each other. And I think we're kind of there, right? We're kind of there. So our kids are growing up in that, an ideological intolerance. We don't know how to agree to disagree. A few more macro trends. Artificial intelligence, and I'm doing a conference on this in October, so I've been studying this. I could do a whole thing on this. But in the same way, when we gave our kids phones, and maybe you guys haven't done that yet, but I have, one of the hooks for us to give our kids phone was what? Safety, right? We thought we need to give our kids a phone in case they get stuck, in case they're in a place where they need to call us. And that's really what helped push us over the edge for safety.
There's nothing in your music library.
Whoop. I don't have anything in my music library. So when I think about artificial intelligence, I mean, there's so many things that I think can be even more destructive than phones in artificial intelligence. Because what's going to hook us into it as parents is productivity, performance, and even a little bit of relief. Because there are platforms, there are things being designed where kids can create a friend, where they can have a counselor that's AI, where they can create their own identity, where they will be listened to by a machine and feel more heard than what they feel with humans, right? And so if we're not careful as parents, if we don't pay attention, our kids are going to detach from people and attach to fake people through artificial intelligence. And so we have to be careful about that. There's certainly wonderful things about it. There's going to be things that are helpful. There's already things that we know and that we use. But what we have to realize is that the deepest need of our kids right now is loneliness. And some of the artificial intelligence can meet that need. And that's where you have a disaster happening. Because if kids pull away from people, then we have issues with a lot of things, right? Disconnection becomes an even greater problem. So social media has divided us. Artificial intelligence may detach our kids if we're not careful. So artificial intelligence. Dehumanization. Our body is just stuff. Transhumanism, pornography, all of those things have created sort of a dehumanization. And we see even our Gen Zers having problem with relationships, particularly guys who have been involved in a lot of pornography have a really hard time then connecting with a real girl who's not perfect. And so that's part of that dehumanization. And so we have to work against that, right? And so one of the greatest things that we can give our kids is relationship-rich environments, and the church is absolutely the best place for that to happen. And some of y'all probably experienced that, and your kids have experienced that this weekend, where you've really connected with families and connected with kids, and that's what's going to make a difference. The last thing is confirmation bias. And you see that, I've seen that this week in the media, but we essentially only read and listen to the things that we already agree with, and even our feeds, the algorithms feed us things that we already agree with. Something that I say today will be on your Facebook feed tonight because it heard me talking about it, right? And so what I see too is not only we have confirmation bias, we double down on our view, even if we later find out that what we read wasn't really true. Right? So we have a real difficulty being humble and admitting that maybe we were misinformed about something, or maybe there's other facts that we didn't know before we took this really harsh stand on whatever happened in our world. And so confirmation bias. It's really negative so far, isn't it? Are y'all feeling the weight? I don't want you to feel too much of the weight. We're going to get to some positive things, but I do think it's part of understanding where we're at, and we have to, I think, parent a little bit differently. So there's another book that is all about performance, and it's called Never Enough. And it makes the claim that for today's kids, it's less about measuring up than measuring over. Everybody needs to stand out from the crowd. And so in that performance-dominated culture, that is what feeds some of the anxiety of our kids, is feeling like they always have to not just be average, not just be good, but they always have to be over the top, right? And again, at the college level, and you probably see this too, a lot of times they show up at college and they hit that first B plus or that first C or whatever it might be, and it completely shuts them down, and they don't know how to deal with that because they think everything about them is about performance, right? And so a couple of things that they also talk about in this book is just how empathy is a lot lower today with our Gen Zers, particularly. We feel like that could be true with our Gen Alphas. You don't learn empathy playing video games. You learn empathy out on the playground, bumping into each other, knocking someone down, seeing that you hurt them, helping them, feeling what they feel. That has to happen in human relationship and in context of people bumping up against each other. It won't happen on a video game. It will always happen person to person. And then the narcissism epidemic, part of that is because of social media. That personal fable has gotten so big, and we think so much of ourselves that it's become this huge epidemic. So, now that we're all sort of discouraged, I want to show you a video that I think sort of pulls a lot of this together. It's actually from a guy, he's I think a 19 or 20-year-old. His name is Sean Killingsworth, and he describes sort of his experience as a college student, what his life was like as a child. And I want you to listen to some of the things that he says, because he makes some points that even if we fixed everything that was wrong, there would still be some difficulty for our kids because of culture, okay? So watch this video. It's about 9 minutes. It's longer than what I normally would show, but I think it's a really good one. Let me get out of the way.
When I was little, I grew up in a small neighborhood with a bunch of boys. And after we finished homeschool for the day, we rode our bikes around, went fishing, swimming, climbing trees, and any other fun thing a kid does outside. When I was 8, we went to an after-school program 2 days a week. And I was excited to play with all the other kids. But no one was playing. They were all playing on their Game Boy, and everyone had one except me. It didn't matter what I tried, and no kid wanted to play when they had their own personal screen. This was my first experience with the isolation devices create. As I got older, I wanted to have adventures, go explore. But everyone's heads were still down. And instead of Pokemon on a Game Boy, it was Instagram and Snapchat on a smartphone. I was 13 when I started to feel real grief. I had no idea what, but I knew something was gone. Okay, so here's the part where this could turn into another talk about how kids should get their face out of their phones, go outside, and talk to people. That's already been said so many times, and it's having no effect. It's because it misses the real problem. The real problem is that an entire ecosystem has been lost. Let me help you understand what I mean by that. Imagine a herd of antelope roaming and grazing the grass of a beautiful savanna. As they roam, they're contributing to their own ecosystem. Now imagine someone introduced feed bins. The antelope stay near the bins. They no longer have to roam and graze the savanna. All the animals stop roaming, creating an unnatural order. Over time, the entire ecosystem of the savanna becomes an unrecognizable wasteland. I've heard my parents tell stories of the savanna. Teenagers roaming the mall, hanging out at the arcade, going on dates. If they wanted to connect with someone, they had to go see them. They were forced out of their house, past their insecurities, and into the wild. There was no other option. And so they did. Everyone did. That was normal. That healthy ecosystem encouraged real connection. Okay, I want you to really understand what I'm saying. I want you to close your eyes. I want you to bring up some of your favorite memories as a teenager with your friends. All the times you hung out, the mall, the dumb stuff you did together. Put yourself back in those memories. Okay, now put those images in a line. Now delete the first one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. Okay, open your eyes. Imagine the landscape of your memories as a teenager without any of that. It's a bit of a wasteland, isn't it? The ecosystem for those experiences doesn't exist anymore. And it's worse than that. Remember all those immature moments you had as a teenager? Those moments are meant to evaporate. Now they're permanent. Because of that, we live under constant scrutiny. We don't get the luxury of just being an immature teenager. We have to watch everything we do and say. Anything can be captured and made permanent. This creates an unsustainable level of anxiety and unnatural pressure. Teenagers judging each other and being insecure is normal and natural, and we can deal with it if the moments evaporate like they're meant to, but they don't. We're anxious because we have to constantly sleep with one eye open in this wasteland. I'll never forget the morning at school I decided to notice the girl walking next to me on her phone. Every kid sitting on a bench lying in the courtyard on their phones. I only saw 3 kids not on their phone. These devices aren't connecting us. They're isolating us next to each other. I knew I needed to make a change. I thought I'd just not go on my phone as much. I deleted Snapchat, added it back. Deleted social media, added it back. I charged my phone outside my room, then I just charged it in my room and be back where I started. Trying to change my behavior was exhausting. Then it hit me. I'm the kid sucked into the Game Boy. If there was no Game Boy, we would have all played together. That's when I decided to get rid of my smartphone completely. So at 15, I got a flip phone and became isolated in a completely different way. There were times when I felt like there was no winning. I made all the changes. I put down my phone. I tried to talk to people. I spent time off social media. But because everyone else was still sucked in, and I do mean everyone, it didn't matter what I did. I was just back to being the only kid without a Game Boy. If we're not careful here, you can miss the whole point of this talk. So listen closely. Kids are lonely, not only because we won't put away our phones, but because when we do, there's nothing for us to turn to instead. We don't actually want our phones or social media or Snapchat. What we want is real connection. But that doesn't happen naturally in this new ecosystem. Everything that naturally breeds real connection has been lost. The new ecosystem breeds isolation. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. It's human connection. Addiction happens when someone is isolated. We don't want to be addicted. But what choice do we have when we're living isolated no matter what we do? I know adults are frustrated because kids won't get their faces out of their phones. But I'm inviting you to understand the real problem. and to have some compassion for us. Because we're starving in a wasteland while you tell us to get back out there onto a savanna that no longer exists. I'm not here to help you feel good. I'm here to help you feel how bad kids feel. I've learned how to create an oasis in this wasteland. More and more of my friends are joining in. They don't go on their phones when we hang out. They don't record anything for the most part. For a couple hours, when we hang out at the dock, playing cards, laughing, telling stories, I imagine the possibility of roaming wild and free.
On your handout, I gave you some sound bites from this, from what he said, things that really hit me. And I want to give you a moment or two among yourselves at your table just to sort of process what you just saw. What are the things that you hadn't thought about before? What are the things that maybe you agree with, maybe you don't agree with? I want to give you just a few minutes to think about some of those things, because I think there's some real interesting wisdom in what he says. I think there's a lot of things that, one of the things that I had never thought about was the fact that when I did dumb things, it wasn't captured. I could be a 15-year-old girl and do something dumb and not have to worry about that being captured and sent all over my school or whatever. I didn't grow up with that kind of stress. So that was really helpful for me to understand part of why our kids today have anxiety. So take a few minutes and just sort of process it with each other, and then I'll ask some of y'all to share.
No record of it. What if something bad happens? But I don't do anything with it. So my approach to this is, I don't have this picture, but this was weird. That was my takeaway. So you told me to put it down, and you look up, and you see that's a So we started talking about what are safer today. All high school is like
Okay, if you'll wrap up a little bit. I wish I could hear each table. All right, let's come back together. And I know that at your tables you had great conversation, and maybe you'll have time to have more conversation about it later. But somebody maybe share something that your really brilliant neighbor said that you think all of us should hear, if you're too shy to say it yourself. What's a takeaway?
I think Rich is leading the way. He's got a flip phone.
Good job, Rich. Way to go.
finally got like 5 years ago. I did.
Okay. Okay, good.
You know, the big point I told Tom was that this concept of, so they put their phone down, if they want to be the one that says, I'm going to do better.
Yeah.
And there's nothing.
Right. And I think that's what's hard as parents too, is if we take that phone away from our kids, if there's not other parents that are willing to do that, then we are creating an even more difficult situation. And I'm going to show you a book in a person that's trying to address some of this here in just a minute. But yeah, I think that's the big takeaway. And as a church, we have to ask ourselves too, okay, what is there for our kids to attach to here? Because church used to be the center of our lives. And now it's just one of the things that we do. And so I think the church has a really unique space that we can step back into and make that more communal and make that more of a place where kids can put their phone down. When I was in children's ministry, we had to decide at one point, are we going to let kids have phones or not? And at the time, we said, oh, we'll let them because they can read the Bible on it, right? So that's how we sort of justified it. But now, today, if I was a children's minister, which I'm not, and I'm not trying to speak for people who are, but I think I would make it a no-phone zone, just so that kids would really have to connect with each other. Okay, what else? What else did somebody take away from this?
We were trying to figure out like where kids would go if we did send them out in the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And like you can't go to the mall, like you don't really see kids hanging out, teenagers on their own. Mm-hmm. Like there's rules against it at the mall.
Yeah.
And
Right.
maybe one of the reasons is because it's a lot more dangerous today than it was back then. But the statistics show that it's way safer.
It is way safer. Our kids are way safer.
We don't have any excuses.
Yeah. I mean, there are real dangers in our world, but in terms of, and that's what Jean Twenge brings out in her book, like our kids are the physically safest they've ever been. We put them in car seats. We have them doing all these things that I never did as a kid. I remember driving down the highway in the back of my grandpa's truck in a lawn chair drinking a Dr. Pepper, right? That's a Gen Xer, right? We just didn't worry about those things. So they are safer, but we see all of the danger as moms, as dads. For instance, I have a DFW scanner on my Facebook, and so it's always talking about fatalities on the road. I see that every day. So it feels to me like it's so much more dangerous out there, and the reality is it's probably about the same.
And the news stories on your phone aren't the
happy stories.
Right.
Yeah, they're the ones that really get to the heart of everything. So good, very good. So where would they go, right?
Well, and I wonder now, have we as adults also lost it? So we have gone, we're right behind, some adults are right behind kids in terms of losing some of that connection with
Right.
phones and what- So
Yeah.
do we know how to tell kids to build those connections?
Yeah.
Because we've almost lost it ourselves.
Oh yeah, I think if we're all honest, there's a level of loneliness that we have. We're more connected digitally than we've ever been, but it's a pseudo connection. We're not really connected. Yeah. So, and I think part of how we manage, I think I said this, how we manage our kids' anxiety and how we manage our kids' phone usage and those types of things is to work on us too. So, okay, we'll keep moving. Let me show you this book that if you like to read, it's not a Christian book. The guy who wrote it's Jonathan Haidt. He also wrote The Coddling of the American Mind and a couple other really good ones. But he has kind of joined up with Sean Killingsworth and other people, and they're actually trying to introduce legislation to remove some of this access for kids. And the real problem is what? It's us. None of us are really willing to step over that line and say, yeah, we're not going to let our kids have social media when they're 10 or 11 or 12 or whatever it might be. But he wrote a book called The Anxious Generation. He's all over everywhere right now speaking about it. And he says that we have shifted from a play-based childhood to a phone or technology-based childhood. And that's his thesis for the anxiety, for the anxious generation. And so he's actually an atheist, but he is saying some things that we would say, and he also has a chapter about religious and spiritual communities, and he acknowledges that that is a place where kids could get this need. He even talks about the value of synchronous religious rituals. Synchronous, right? So when COVID came, we ended up doing a lot of asynchronous. And so when we watch worship, it's different than when we're in the room with people. I mean, synchronous activities together are powerful. It's probably why our kids like to do the line dancing and all those things, because they're doing something together, right? It creates community, it creates connection. And so he has a lot of really good things to say, but I will warn you that he's not faith-based. But it's one of the best books to come out, and he's really trying hard to persuade people. The problem is us, but the problem is also big business, right? Because our attention is their money. Their whole goal is to keep our attention. And so it's very hard to strip that away. So all that to say, here's just a few things. I'm not going to hit everything. You'll have everything in your packet. But they're born from 2010 to now. When they were born was the year that Instagram and iPad launched, so it doesn't seem like it's been that long. One of the things that I think I try to drive home to even my children's and family ministry students is that the majority of them are from a non-traditional, hurting, or dysfunctional household. And so our churches are really not geared towards that. We're geared more towards the nuclear two-parent family. So it's something that we have to think about. It's something that we have to think about when we are creating ministry, that we've got to fill in some gaps for some of these kids. Their first babysitter was an iPad. By one statistic, an average 7-year-old will already spent 1 year in front of a screen. And so we want to be careful about those screens. They're more into creating technology than consuming it. If you think about the things that they do, they're co-creating, collaborating as they go, creating YouTube channels, all of the different games that they play. Their job market is pretty much unknown because 65% of them will end up working in a job that we don't even know about yet, right? Let's think about play one more time. And I want you to watch this real quick video. And it's put out by Nature Valley, but they asked 3 different generations, what did they like to do for fun when they're a kid? Has anybody seen this? Okay, good. I think you'll like it. And we'll talk about it afterwards.
Nature Valley created an eye-opening video by asking 3 generations of people in different families one very simple question. When you were a kid, what did you do for fun?
So we go blueberry picking, for instance.
We grew watermelons, plantains.
I found an old sign which was big enough for me to sit on, made of great toboggan. It was very slick and very fast.
Not surprisingly, the older generations spoke about playing outside and creating their own games.
You know, you go door to door, get a group of kids, and you're just going out to the field and playing baseball.
And we built these massive forts, you know, the kind that you can actually sit in and play in, you know, with our friends, and it was just really wonderful.
The kids' description of fun activities were eye-opening.
Video games. I like to go on my phone, text, send email.
My favorite thing to do in the world is definitely watching videos and playing video games.
I would die if I didn't have my tablet.
Whenever I feel upset, I play video games and I feel normal. It's really wonderful.
It's scary to think that they'll never have to leave the house.
I actually feel a little sad because I feel like he's missing out on what's out there in the beautiful world.
Nature Valley.
So Nature Valley is wanting to get kids outside, so we'll stop there. I want you to turn to your neighbor and just talk about what differences did you hear in how the adults talked about play and how the kids talked about play. It's pretty obvious, but I want you to think about it and talk about it, or just something that stood out to you about that. Okay, let's come back together. We still have a few more slides to hit. So there's two ways to talk about this. We could talk about what they talked about, but we could also talk about how they talked about it, right? So what was the difference between what they talked about? That's the easy one, right? What did the kids talk about? Games, technology, right? What did the adults talk about? Outside, creative play. Okay, so that's the what. Now think about how they talked about it. What did you notice that was different in how they talked about it with the kids and how the adults talked about it?
I would have died if I didn't have to.
That's pretty dramatic, right? I'm glad I'm not her mama. Yeah, no drama.
Kids were like anxious.
Yeah.
Until they play their video.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The adults were like relaxed, happy.
Until they watch the kids' videos.
Yeah. There we go. Yeah, I mean, that girl is definitely, but are we much different? Like, when we think we've left our phone somewhere, do we not panic, right? When the Wi-Fi goes out at my house, everybody comes out of the bedrooms, right? And wants to know what's going on. So, yeah, she's dramatic, for sure, but we're not that much different. So, yeah, so good. The adults, what did y'all say about the adults? They were...
Seemed happier.
Seemed happier, yeah. They talked about it. Did you notice the language? The kids, because I know we're running out of time, I'm just going to tell you. The kids, it was I. What was the adults? We. See, that's that individualism, that hyper-individualism versus the collectivism that's healthy, the community, the communal. And so we have to teach our kids how to be we, because everything in the world is I. And if we're not careful at church, it can be the same thing, because church has become pretty hyper-individualized, pretty hyper-generational, right? So it's all about what worship style do I, and I'm going to step on toes, and I'm sorry, but what worship style do I like? What do I want? What do I need out of this, right? Even for our kids, did you have fun? You know, it's all about them. And what I think would be a healthier thing is if we could think about the we and think about what is best for our church as a whole. And sometimes what's best for our church as a whole is not what we prefer, right? Because what's best for our church is for kids to be a part of a community with lots of different generations. To be able to see those faithful people, to have their friends. Friends are important, peers are important, but they also need to know that the people that have gone before them have been through difficult times. And so I go to the old people's service and I sit in the balcony, and one of the reasons that I go, and I know I'm weird, but I'm very inspired by our older people. And I remember there was one Sunday where there was a gentleman in the choir who a week before had lost his wife. He's singing in the choir the next week. And then Don Newberry, who was the former president at Howard Payne, his daughter at 41 passed away. He was in church like 2 days later sitting down front. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, that, you know, I'm not saying we all have to do that, but that's faithfulness. Like, that helps me see somebody that's going through something difficult, but they're still showing up and people are loving on them. And so I think when we remove kids from a big community, they miss out and we miss out. I'm in a life group and I'm the youngest one in it, but not by a lot. But one of the big benefits for me is that when I'm struggling as a parent, I can always say, hey, I'm just not sure about this. And one of the ladies who's been there, done that, will say, Shelly, I promise it's going to be okay. I remember when my son did that. Does that make sense? So we're better together. We're better as we than just as me or I. So I think that's the thing that our kids need to learn. They need to learn to value the older people, learn from the older people. They also need things for themselves. So the we is important. We're going to go through these characteristics real quick. When we think about Gen Alpha, these are some of the things that research is saying physically. They have a decline in fine motor skills because swiping is not a fine motor skill, right? Fine motor skills happen when we let them sort things and work with clay and Play-Doh and cut things, even when they cut like a disaster. Right? I teach kindergarten Sunday school and they don't cut very well, but guess what? They need practice. right? So our kids have a decline in fine motor skills because we don't let them do those kinds of things. Some research is showing weaker hands because they're not crawling as much, they're not doing the monkey bars. We've sort of taken away some of those things from them, so their hands strength is different. Now, you guys are more in the country a little bit more, I think, so you may have some differences because you all may have kids on the farm, which actually is amazing because kids on the farm get lots of microbes, get lots of dirt. And this next one, the hygiene hypothesis, says that the kids who are around a lot of dirt actually are healthier. There's a book called Let Them Eat Dirt. And if you don't allow your body to be exposed to stuff, it never learns how to fight stuff. Y'all are laughing.
She's doing great at that.
Okay, good deal. Obesity, here's an interesting one, increased myopia. So myopia is that kids can see up close really well. But what pediatricians are telling us is that their far away vision is not as good. Why do you think this vision is so good? Screens, right? So guess what the best way to practice that muscle, to work on that muscle for far away vision is?
Move the screen further away.
Always a smart aleck, yeah. That would help, yeah. What else?
Go outside.
Go outside, because when we're outside, we look further down the field, right? Our vision is cast further. So those are some things about physical. Mentally, instead of learning to love books, what they've learned to stream. Artificial intelligence is going to sneak up on us, I think. I don't like to be a fear monger at all. But even in the college classroom, and you're probably experiencing this, we have students writing papers with AI. So they're skipping from that knowledge, understanding level all the way to the create level, and they haven't a clue how they got there because the machine told them how to do it, right? And so the brain development's going to shift and change. If you think about my Gen Zers would not be able to read a map because their phone tells them where to go, right? There's things that we've all sort of fallen into where we're not developed in some of those areas, and maybe we don't need it as long as we always have GPS, as long as somebody doesn't cut off GPS to the world, we can all do it. But there's going to be things that that artificial intelligence changes in our kids. And part of the thesis of that book is that our kids' brains are being rewired with technology, right? That they're not getting those good human connections. So socially and emotionally, we've already hit on a lot of this stuff, so we don't need to go into that. And you've got the list. I think we've already actually hit on all of those. Spiritually, it's like when we look at faith development theorists, there's a value in a conventional faith that develops as a result of growing up in a faith tradition, but then also having a real positive peer group, youth group type experience where there is this solidification of this is what my group believes and this is what I believe, and then they move into trying to figure out if that's what they believe. But some of that stuff has been lost, and it's almost like before the jello has even set, people are already poking holes in their faith. Whereas maybe you and I know some of y'all are younger than me, but we really didn't face a lot of people that were antagonistic to my faith until I was much older. Children today are already aware that people don't believe like them. And they can be even pitted against each other because they don't believe. And so that's why that biblical worldview is so important, that we try to set with them when they're very young. And so spiritually, though, we have a post-Christian world, and we sort of have a post-church world where church, again, is just one of the spokes of our life instead of it being sort of the center. And COVID kind of lulled us into believing, and I can be lulled into this too, that, I can just watch it today. I can just watch it online, and that's not the same. And so in some ways, we're a post-church world. They are exposed to all of those opposing worldviews, and so there's sort of this ingrained skepticism that they're not quite sure who to believe. So what are some strengths, though, of Gen Alpha? Let's talk about a few of those so that you're not depressed. So I think that some of them will be more adaptable and more resilient. than previous generations, particularly maybe Gen Z, because when they were children, this thing called COVID happened, and what they learned was that life doesn't always go exactly the way they want to. Now, some of them, obviously, if they were babies or ones or twos, that's not going to be as big of a deal. But for the kids who didn't get to have birthday parties but had birthday parades, for kids who didn't get to have graduations, they found out at a young age that their parents don't control the world, and that's a really good thing, right? And they found out that they can make lemonade out of lemon. They found out that they can be creative. And so in some ways, there's some hope that maybe they can be a little more adaptable and a little bit more resilient. I do think they have a bigger appetite for community. And I think that if they could be honest, they would much rather have a close community than an entertainment, fun-based church. They would much rather be a part of a place where they belong, and maybe you can do both, but that they really want that. I think that they can potentially have a very big global mindset. Missions can be something that maybe this generation dials down into. I think you already see Gen Z. They're not so much interested in building a big building or being a part of a big institution, but they are interested in helping orphanages or fostering kids or those types of things. And so there's some things about them that I think are going to be very positive. They're going to value authenticity over performance. We already see that shift in churches, I think, where we're shifting from church as a theater to church as a family. I think that's a younger generation driven thing. And then I think they are champions for diversity because that's what they've grown up in, right? It's normal to them. And so those are some strengths. So what are the needs that they have? These are the things, the number one need that I feel the most burden for them is this idea of truth. How are we going to get them to know God's truth and to look to God's truth as absolute truth? That is the number one need that I think they have, and there's no shortcuts for that. That is something that takes intentional teaching, consistency, involvement, and there's a slide that I'll show later that says the further a society drifts from truth, the more it will hate those who speak it. And I think that's kind of where we are in our world. And so truth, they need to see us going to the Bible, looking to the Bible as God's truth. They need an unfiltered faith. They live in a very filtered world, and yet they are lonely, they are struggling, they are anxious, and if we're not careful at church, we can only tell the happy stories. We can only emphasize the really Instagram-worthy testimonies. But in reality, most of us don't have Instagram-worthy lives, right? We go through hard things. It's part of being a Christian doesn't mean that we don't suffer. And so we've got to teach our kids that in the midst of suffering, there's hope. And one of the places we find hope is in our church community. They need mentors, particularly these kids growing up without two parents, growing up without fathers, which goes to the next one, gap fillers. We need people who will stand in the gap and fill in some of those gaps for kids. To be a father to the fatherless. They need a relational pedagogy, which basically means not what I'm doing right now, right? It's sitting down, it's relational teaching. For too long, we've sort of relied on the charismatic one person up in front of everybody, and that's not where true transformation happens. With a child, it happens in conversation, in life, and in relationships. So that's hard because it requires more people, but our kids really need relationships. Then they need to be taught how to have micro-empathy. So our Gen Zers are great, and I have Gen Zers, in particular my oldest one. He sees all the things that are wrong in the world that we need to fix, but then when I ask him, what's that thing you're doing to help that? Well, I'm still just a college student. I can't do that yet. Right? So our Gen Zers have big macro empathy, but they're not good at walking it out. So our kids need to learn to walk out in micro ways, empathy, and sharing with other people. So micro empathy. We're going to have to shut it down here. Maybe this is, I didn't get to everything. Maybe this is a good reminder to us from Spurgeon. It says, train up a child in the way he should go, but be sure you go that way yourself. The greatest way we can influence our kids is for us to live out our faith in front of them. Doesn't mean we're always going to be perfect. As a matter of fact, I think there's value when we admit when we've messed up, when we share with our kids our struggles in age-appropriate ways, so that they can normalize the fact that it's not a, one of my students, I don't think I have a picture of it. See, I didn't get to do all this with y'all. One of my students told me, she said, I feel like sometimes I was taught in the church this yellow brick road theology, that if I just follow Jesus, everything's going to be great. And she said, when I got out into the real world, what I realized is not everything was great, and I didn't feel like I was prepared for it. And so I think that's one of the gifts that we can give our kids, is to help them and to be authentic with them in our faith. For them to see us growing and learning and changing ourselves. Because if their faith isn't real, and if we haven't given them an authentic faith, when they face really hard times, there's two things that I've seen happen, and especially in the counseling world, is they have two common paths. They may think, number one, God's not real, because this wouldn't have happened. Or number two, maybe it's me. It's shame and blame. And both of those ways sort of lead them away from God. But what we want, what you want, is for them to have grown up normalizing struggle, normalizing what it's like to be an authentic Christian that says there are good days and there are bad days. And so that when they face something, they might say, instead of maybe it's God, maybe not, God's not real, or maybe it's me, is they would say, this is really hard, but I know it's normal to face difficulties. I'll lean into my faith to get through this. I've done hard things before, and I can do this hard thing. That's what we want kids to get to that point. I had to skip over a whole bunch, but I did give you the slides, so maybe you can catch that. Let me pray with us, and I'm sorry that I was so rushed, but let's pray. God, there's a lot to think about. And God, I think I would just ask and pray that you give each person in this room just one little nugget to think about and to decide how to maybe apply to their homes. Lord, we can just get completely overwhelmed if we try to solve all these problems. But Lord, help us just to take that one next step. Maybe it's just being more involved in the church. Maybe it's deciding as parents to make church the place where kids can find real connection. Whatever it might be, Lord, I pray that you would just convict each of us in this room of the one thing that we can do to help create that biblical worldview and to create an environment where that biblical worldview grows and flourishes. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.